Hi darlings, Mimi G here of MimiGstyle.com, and I'm so excited to be able to provide you step-by-step video tutorials to accompany my Mimi G for Simplicity patterns. Today we're going to be doing pattern 1283 View D, which is the jacket. Let's get started. Let's go over some of the basic tools you're going to need. You are, of course, going to need Simplicity pattern 1283. It comes in size 6 to 14 and 16 to 24. You're going to need some disappearing fabric markers, a seam ripper, some pins, 2 scissors, one for paper and one for fabric, and some pattern weights or large washers that I pick up at my local home improvement store. You're also going to need some interfacing and fabric, so let's talk about that. I'm using a lightweight interfacing. This is 85% rayon. It's very lightweight, so it won't change the body of my jacket. I do not want a crisp collar, so I'm using a very light interfacing just to add some stability. Now, you're also going to need some fabric for your jacket. This is a woven jacket, so you can use a gabardine, any linen type, a wool blend, which is what I'm using for this tutorial. For View D, we're going to be cutting out the following pieces. We are going to need piece 20, which is our sleeve. We're going to use piece 16, which is the back. We're going to cut out number 12, which is our front piece. We're also going to be cutting out our tie belt, which is number 21. Our back facing piece, number 19. Our side belt loops, which is number 15. We're going to do our facing pieces, which is number 18. And finally, our collar piece, which is number 17. Okay, I have folded my fabric in half lengthwise with salvage edges meeting and right sides facing. And I gave it a little bit of a press because it was wrinkled. If your fabric is wrinkled or your pattern pieces are wrinkled, it's totally okay to give it a quick iron just to smooth out any bumps or ripples or anything that might be in your fabric or on your tissue. Now I've laid out my pattern piece and I've used my pattern weights, and I'm simply going to cut around my pattern pieces. Now before I move my tissue pattern, I want to make sure that I snip all of my notches. So you should double check, make sure that you've snipped everywhere you see a notch. And then everywhere that you see a small dot or a large dot, you want to make sure that you mark it as well. So the easiest way for me to do it is for example, in this dart area here, I would use my pin and I put it right in the size number. I cut out a size 8, so I put it in the size 8 dot. And then I'll remove my pattern weights, and using my disappearing fabric marker, I will make a dot where that pin is on both sides. And that will let me know where the end of my dart is. And then I'll continue that for all of the dots that I see on my pattern piece. I like to make a couple of dots along the dashed line that you see, just so that I know when I'm sewing to just follow that guide. And so I just poke a little hole through my paper. And then when you remove it, you have your dots, and that will serve as your sewing guide. Now that we have cut out all of our fabric pieces, all we have left to do is to cut out 3 pieces out of interfacing. That's the facing, the collar, and the back facing. And so you're going to lay these out on top of your interfacing the same way that you did your fabric, and you're going to cut around them the same way that you cut your fabric. And so once you have your interfacing cut out, this is the back facing, for example, and you have it out of your fabric, you want to lay the bumpy side, the part that is fusible, the glue part, onto the wrong side of your fabric. And then you simply are going to press and hold until they fuse. You want to avoid this motion, so just press and hold a couple of seconds. Once they're fused together, it becomes one piece. You want to do that for the remaining pieces. Now that we have all of our cut pieces of fabric and our interfacing has been fused, we are ready to start sewing. We are going to start with our front piece, and so before we sew our dart, we're going to do a line of stay stitching all down the front of it, the center front, to avoid any stretching when we attach our collar or sewing around curves. So all you're going to do is place your needle into your fabric, and all along the center front we're going to sew a stay stitching line that's 1/2 inch away from the edge of your fabric. You're going to do that stitching line on both pieces at the center front. Now that we've sewn our stay stitching, we are going to sew our dart. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by pinning at the very end of our dart, which was that very last dot that you should have marked. And then I'm going to have you fold in half where the opening, the cut opening is, and pin at the top. And then you should have made your little dots to help you sew following that little guide. So wherever you see a dot, go ahead and just pin. And as you're sewing, you're just going to connect the darts until you sew directly off of your fabric. Make sure that your dots match on both sides. Using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, we're going to sew from dot to dot until we reach the end, and we're going to sew directly off. Now you want to tie off your ends. And this will avoid any bumps or dimples in the dart. And you're all done. You want to do the same thing to the other piece. I like to press my dart open, so what I do is I cut a little further into my dart, and then I will press this open and then to one side, so just so that it lays flat. So go ahead and take it to your ironing table, snip as close to the end as you can, of course without getting too close, and then press this open. As you can see, I have snipped open my dart as far as I could go, and I have pressed it open, so now it's nice and flat. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to do our belt loops and attach them to the front piece before we sew our front to back at the shoulders and the side seams. So set this aside, and we're going to work with our belt loops. Now you should have cut 2 pieces that look like this. And what you're going to do is you're going to first press it in half like this. And once you give it a good press in half, you're going to open it back up and you're going to fold it again so that both ends meet the center, like this, and press it. And then you're going to fold it again. And we're going to sew close to the edge. Go slow, especially if your fabric is a little thick. you're going to do the other loop the same way. Okay, I'm working on one front piece right now. And so just under the underarm, you're going to see that you have a notch. And then below that notch, you should have marked a little dot, right? And so at that dot is where we're going to attach our belt loop. So what you're going to do is you're going to fold it in half like this and pin it, make your life easy. And we're just going to stitch it down. So using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I just want you to stitch down your belt loop to your side. And you're done. You're going to do it to the other front piece the same exact way. Now we're working with our back piece, and so we want to sew our center back seam. So first you want to make sure to align your notches. You should have 3. And then you want to pin at the top. And then pin at the bottom. And maybe one more. And starting at the bottom, we're going to sew using 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way up. Now that we have sewn our center back seam, this is an unlined jacket, so you have 2 options. Well, you have several options actually. You could do a Hong Kong finish on your seam, you could do a bound finish, you can simply serge each side, or you can serge both edges together and then give this a good press. I chose to finish my seams with a serged edge on both sides and then pressing my seam open. And now we're going to stay stitch the back. So we're going to start at the center and work our way towards the shoulder, and then start again at the center and work our way towards the other shoulder. So using or placing your needle in the center and then working 1/2 inch away from the neck edge, we're going to sew to the shoulder and stop. And now we're going to start at the center again and work our way towards the other shoulder. And now this will assure that when we attach our collar, our neckline won't stretch. Now that we have stay stitched our neck in the back, we're going to attach front to back at shoulder seams. So I want you to place your front piece to your back piece, right sides facing, and you're going to pin at the shoulder. Make sure to align your notch. Pin again at the front. And we're going to sew across using 5/8 inch seam allowance. And you can finish that off by serging it or zigzagging it if you don't have a serger. And now we're going to sew down the side. So I want you to align your notch at your side seams and pin. Pin at the top. Pin at the bottom. And then pin one more time. And starting at the bottom, we're going to sew up the side seam. 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. When you reach your belt loop, it may be a little thick, so go slow. Once you pass your belt loop, I want you to go back and sew over it again. And now continue to the end. Now we have sewn our sides and our shoulder, and we did a double stitch over the belt loop just to make sure that it's secure. And now you can finish off your seam allowance with a serger or a zigzag stitch, and I want you to sew the other front to back at the shoulder and side the same way. I have pressed my seams now, and I went ahead and finished with my serger on both my shoulder and my side seams. And now it's nicely pressed and the jacket's starting to take shape. So I'm going to set this aside and we're going to stitch together our collar. So grab your 4 collar pieces. 2 of them should be interfaced and 2 are not. Working first with the interface collar, I want you to match up your notches on the straight edge, not the curved edge. So you should have 2 notches. And we're going to sew these together. So go ahead and pin at your notch. And then maybe pin one more time. And we're going to sew these together using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And I want you to press this open. And I want you to sew the non-interfaced collar together at the center the same way and then press that seam open as well. Okay, now that you have sewn both collars together at the center back, I want you to place them on top of each other with right sides facing. So first align your seams and pin there first. And then you want to pin a couple more times. And we're going to be sewing around the curved edge, not the straight one. Okay, now I don't want this to stretch out of shape while we're sewing, so we're going to start at the center back, and we're going to sew along the edge, over the rounded edge, and then we're going to stop, and then we're going to sew the other side the same way, starting at the center and working our way down. Using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, And you're going to sew from the center down the other direction. Now that we have sewn all around the top, we're going to trim this and then clip our curves. So what you want to do is we're going to trim down to 1/4 inch. All the way down, and in the curve section you're going to cut out little triangles like that. This will remove a lot of the fullness in the curve. Just make sure that you don't snip into your stitching. Like this, and then just continue removing some of the seam allowance. And you want to clip your other curve the same way. Now that we have clipped our curved edge and have trimmed off our seam allowance, we are going to understitch the collar. So we want to make sure that the seam allowance is pressed towards the non-interfaced side, and we're going to stitch close to the edge. So as you can see, my seam allowance is pressed towards my non-interfaced collar, and my needle is about maybe 1/8 away from the seam line, and we're going to stitch all the way down. As you're going along, make sure that you can feel your seam allowance and that it's facing the correct direction. I have pressed my collar, and as you can see, the understitching is on the inside, and now that will help to keep the inside of our collar from rolling onto the right side. So the understitching will be on the inside. No one will see that part, so you want to make sure that when you understitch and press that you don't see any of your understitching on the right side, and it gives it a nice, clean, and pressed, crisp finish. Now we want to baste this closed, so using a basting stitch, a very, very long stitch, however long you have, we're going to stitch 1/2 inch away from the edge of our fabric, and we're going to just close this edge. Make sure that both your fabric pieces are aligned at the edge. We are going to attach our collar to our jacket, and so what we want to do before we start to pin is make sure that you are attaching your collar with the wrong side to the right side of your jacket, meaning the understitched side of your collar should be facing down, and you should only be able to see the right side with no understitching on the collar, and then of course the right side of our jacket. And so we're going to pin at the center back, so align your center back seams for both your collar and your jacket, and then your notches. And then I want you to pin that dot that's on your collar to your shoulder seam on your jacket, and then do the other dot to the other shoulder. And then we're going to go down the jacket, and your collar should be ending where your dot is So you have a dot there on your jacket. That is where we're going to end our collar. So I want you to pin it. And I want you to then pin a couple more times just to keep that in place. And then pin the other side of your jacket and collar. So make sure that your collar ends at that dot. And then pin a couple more times. And now we're going to sew our collar down. We're going to sew it starting at the center back and then down one side, and then we'll start again from the center back down the other side. And we're going to use 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Using a regular length stitch. Go slow, make sure there aren't any folds underneath. Okay, I'm done sewing all the way down one end, and then I started back at the center back, and I sewed my collar down in the other direction. So now it's all sewn down to my jacket, and now we're going to prepare our sleeve. Okay, you should have a couple of markings on your sleeve. You should have 3 dots. You should have a double notch for the back of your sleeve and 1 single notch for the front of your sleeve, and then down each side you should have 2 notches. Now my fabric has some give, so I can simply align my notches when we get to sewing our sides, and I can ease this in simply by stretching a bit. If your fabric does not have any give, on the side that has the double notch, you may need to do 2 rows of gathering stitches from one notch to the other notch to help ease this when we sew one side to the other. You're going to create those gathering stitches the same way that I'm going to create the gathering stitches for our sleeve cap now. So what you're going to do is, using a basting stitch, the longest stitch you have, you're going to start at 1 dot and you're going to end at the other. So I'm going to start at 1 dot, 5/8 of an inch away from the edge of my fabric, and I'm going to back stitch at the beginning. And then I'm going to sew all the way till I reach this other dot. And then I'm going to pull my threads. Then I'm going to go back to where I started, a 1/4 inch away from where I did my initial stitching, and I'm going to do that again. Now I've created 2 rows of gathering stitches, so when I pull the top threads, it will gather that sleeve cap and will help me to ease it in when we start to sew it. So you may need to do that on the double notched side if your fabric has no give. If it does have some give like mine, then you can just pin and sew together. So now that we have created the gathering stitches on our sleeve cap, go ahead and do that to the other sleeve cap, and then we're going to sew down our sides. So I want you first to pin at your notches. Right sides are facing. Pin at the bottom. And starting at the bottom, we're going to sew all the way up using a regular length stitch and 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And you can finish off your side seam either with a serger or with a zigzag stitch. And you're going to do the same exact thing that we just did to the other sleeve. Now I'm going to show you how to insert the sleeve. So we're going to do a set-in sleeve, and I want you to turn your sleeve right sides out so that it's facing the proper way. And I want you to start with your jacket right side out as well. And I want you to pin at the side seam and underarm seam. So align that and pin there first. Once that's pinned, I want you to turn your jacket to the wrong side. Now I want you to pin at your notches first, that single notch, and then your double notch. And you should have marked your dots both on your sleeve and on your jacket. So your sleeve should have a dot and your jacket should have a dot. And so you want to align those dots. That's why it's so important to transfer all markings. And then on the other side you'll see another dot. And you should match it to the dot on your jacket and pin it. And now we're going to look at the sleeve cap. And as you can see, the sleeve cap has a lot more fullness than the actual jacket does. So we need to ease that sleeve cap into the jacket. That's the reason we created these gathering stitches. So we're going to pull on these stitches. Now we don't want to create pleats, gathers. We just want to ease the sleeve cap in. So we're trying to remove fullness without creating any real gathers. And then go ahead and pin your dot to your shoulder seam. And then once you have enough fullness removed, go ahead and pin in between those two. And then pin here. By simply just pulling a little bit on those gathering stitches, it eases it enough that you can ease your cap into your jacket and not create any pleats or gathers. And now we can start to sew around using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm going to start at one notch. And I'm going to sew all the way around. Now go ahead and turn it over and make sure you don't have any pleats or gathers. It should be a nice smooth sleeve cap. If you do have pleats or gathers, look at the inside, remove the stitches, and ease your sleeve cap a bit more. Once you have it the way you need it to be, go ahead and finish off the edges, your seam allowance. You can remove it and use your serger or your zigzag stitch. I have already done my other sleeve, So you can go ahead and do the other sleeve the same way we did this one and finish it off nicely. Now that you have attached your sleeves, I want you to try your jacket on and see if you need to shorten the sleeve. And if you do, you can take up more of a hem. I folded up 3/8 of an inch and then another inch because it was just a tad bit long. And so now that I have folded and pressed 3/8 of an inch and then pressed again 1 inch, I'm going to sew very close to the folded edge to create my hem. Now that we have finished the hem of our sleeve and it's a nice finish on the inside, we're going to set the jacket aside and we're going to sew together our facings. So you should have 2 pieces for the facing and then 1 piece for the back facing. And so we're going to first stitch them together at the shoulder. So you want to locate the notch on both ends of your back facing and front facing. And you want to pin at your notch and then maybe pin in the front, and then go ahead and do the same thing to the other side. So right side's facing, and you want to align your notch and pin, and then pin again. And now we're going to sew them together using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then you're going to sew the other one the same way. And now before we attach this, you should finish off your facings if you'd like, or you could just press them open, which is what I'm going to do because you're not going to see this. And you want to finish off the edge of your facing because that is going to be on the inside of your jacket. So you can do one of 2 things. You can simply serge it like I am about to do, or you can turn under 1/4 of an inch and sew all along the edge, across the back, and then down the front. And then when we attach it at the collar, you will have a finished edge already. I'm going to take mine to the serger and serge all around the curved edge and then down the sides. Okay, as you can see, I finished the edge of my facings. I pressed my seams open, and now I'm going to place it over my collar, right sides facing. So here's my collar and my facing, and I'm going to pin shoulder seam to that dot. So shoulder seam to shoulder seam, and I'm going to pin, and then I'm going to pin shoulder seam to shoulder seam. You should still be able to see your dot. And I'm going to match my notches. And then it's probably getting a little thick there, but we're going to remove some of that in a bit. And then we're going to pin down. And then match your notches that should be on your facing and on your jacket. You should have 2 notches. And then pin at the bottom. And do that to the other side. And then what I want you to do is I want you to take your ruler and I want you to measure up 1 1/4 inches, and I want you to make a dot. And then move a little closer, and do it again, and then make another little dot. You're going to do the same thing on both sides. Once you have the entire facing pinned down, we will sew it on to our jacket. We are going to start at the bottom, and so what you're going to do is you're going to sew 1/4 inch across the bottom, and then we're going to go up the front. So that's why I had you mark your little dots so you can play connect the dots. Now you're going to go sew all the way up, so you want to use your 5/8 inch seam allowance. Back stitch at that connecting point, and we're going to sew until we get to the center back. Once we reach the center back, I want you to back stitch and cut your threads. And now we're going to start sewing from the bottom up. So since we can't sew on this side, we're going to sew this first, and then we're going to turn our fabric around so we can have it to the left of us. So sew your 1 1/4 inch first across the bottom. And now turn your fabric so the facing is on the underside, and stitch till we get to your center back. Once you reach the center back, go past where you stopped stitching and back stitch to make sure that both stitching lines are joined. And now we have attached our facing to our jacket, and now we just need to remove some of this seam allowance, some of the bulkiness if yours is bulky. And then we're going to press this and stitch it down in certain areas so that it doesn't move. And we're going to sew the hem of our jacket, and then we will be done. I'm going to remove the collar seam allowance. It's this center seam allowance. So I'm going to leave the one on the outsides untouched, but I am going to trim down the center one to remove some bulkiness. I'm going to trim it down all the way till I get to the end where the other collar stops. Make sure you're only cutting the center seam allowance. Okay, now that I removed the seam allowance from the middle, and it's already much thinner, so now what you're going to do is we're going to cut off the bottom here and trim our corners here, and then we're going to turn this to the inside, and we need to press it. So go ahead and take your scissors, and we're going to cut, leaving 1/4 inch at the bottom. And then clip your corner and trim off a little bit at the front. I just do a couple of inches. And then do the same thing on the other side. And then turn your corner in. Use a point turner or something sharp to poke out your point so it's nice and sharp. And you're going to do that on both sides, and then once you've done that, you're going to take it to your ironing table and you're going to press this. You may want to press your seam open first so you get a crisp edge. Press it open as far as you can, and then press your facing to the inside. As you can see, I have pressed my facing, it's to the inside. I have also pressed my 1/4 inch at the hem, and then I've pressed up another inch, and then we're going to sew that down. But before we do that, I want to show you a couple of things you should do to keep your facing in place. So the first is we're going to tack it down to the shoulder. So you're going to tack down your shoulder seam on the facing to the shoulder seam on your jacket. And so you just want to make sure it's nice and flat on both sides, right? And you're just going to do a couple of stitches to help hold it in place. So you'll go through the jacket and through the facing, and not very tight. You want a loose stitch. You're just going to do 2 or 3 and then make a knot. And knot. That way your facing at the shoulder will stay in place, and you should do that to both shoulders. And then the last thing is we're going to create a little bit of a fold, and we're going to stitch our collar in place so that it doesn't roll. And so you're going to take your needle, and you want to do this kind of invisible, so you don't want to stitch on top of your collar. You just want to take a little bit of a pleat like I have there, and then you're going to insert your needle and just grab a couple of stitches, and you're going to do that 3 or 4 times. And then make 2 little knots. And that will keep your collar where it's supposed to be. Now once you've done that, make sure you cut off any loose threads. And the only thing left to do for the jacket is to sew our hem. So go ahead and turn under your 1/4 inch and then turn under again so that it's flushed against the turned edge. And we're going to sew close to the pressed edge. All the way around. And that's all there is to it. All we have left to do is to sew together our tie belt. Okay, we are at the finish line. We are going to sew both pieces of our belt together. So go ahead and align the ends right sides facing of your tie belt. And we're going to join them to make it one complete piece. Stitch 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then press this open so it's nice and flat. And then you're going to fold your tie belt in half. And we're going to start it in the center, leaving about a 1.5 inch opening. And we're going to sew in one direction all the way down and across, and then do the other side. Now we're going to sew in 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then pivot and sew across, back stitch here and then at the end. And then you're going to sew in the other direction, starting at the other pin. Once you're done sewing down both sides, go ahead and make a little diagonal cut at each corner. And then using a point turner or a pencil or anything really that you could put in through here that's not going to damage your fabric, you're going to push until you come out of your opening. Remove your point turner. I like to use these because they're handy and they have a sharp corner, so once I have it through, I put it back in and I use it to push out my corners. And the other side. And do the same thing. And now we're just going to sew this closed. So turn your seam allowance for the opening to the inside, and we're going to slip stitch it closed. You can choose to do this with your sewing machine, but this will be more invisible. Now all you have left to do is to give this a good press and you are all done. We are all done. I hope you enjoyed sewing along with me, and I will see you guys again very soon. Peace.